It's a funny, it's not on there. Get out your green sheets. I'll fix that for next service. If you get out your green sheet that's in the middle of your bulletin, right? And you look on this side that has notes. See that funny name there, right? Who built the pyramids? Ask this guy with a funny name. Ozymandias, right? Ozymandias, right? That's the Greek name of the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II. And it's from a poem by the same name written by Percy Blythe Shelley, inspired by this nearly 9-foot tall partial statue of Ramses II that's now in the British Museum. The lower 2/3 of the statue remain out in Egypt in the desert. In fact, you've all seen colossal pictures of this work of art. Anyway, Shelley's poem has an ironic quality to it. It goes like this. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. No thing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Ramses is often depicted as the Pharaoh of the Exodus, right? Famously portrayed by Yul Brynner in the film The Ten Commandments. And while it makes for good cinema, that's poor history. Today, but Ramses lived to be 90 years old. He's a prolific builder. He built most of those pictures you see of ancient Egyptian monuments were probably built by Ramses. And today his monuments, his ruins, what remains of them is simply a popular tourist attraction 3,000 years later. And even the Great Pyramid at Giza, right, that's the famous one that we've all seen pictures of, it was already 1,300 years old by the time Ramses came on the scene, and its construction techniques were long forgotten. In fact, the Great Pyramid at Giza was already old when Abraham and Sarah first went into Egypt before Ishmael and Isaac. And the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt, it's a strange historical period. Outside of the Bible, very few undisputed or undisputable facts exist. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. And we can probably understand why the Egyptians would have left out that rather unflattering part of their own history, right? Fake news and spin is as old as news, it seems. In fact, if you want to watch a kind of slow but interesting documentary, you can go find 2014's Patterns of Evidence Exodus on the internet. I think you can watch it on YouTube, the whole thing. Anyway, as the Hebrews are enslaved to the Egyptians, they would have seen the Great Pyramid. And they would likely have served in the building projects of whichever pharaoh it was. In fact, Egypt has countless grand monuments that served the memory of long-gone men. In fact, many of them were funerary monuments. They were already dead when they were built. All of them were intended to invoke the fearsome power of the one whose reign they indicate. The Bible doesn't tell us much about the day-to-day life of the ancient Hebrews in Egypt. Verses 7 and 9 in our first reading today tell us, the Lord said, I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. And chapter 1, verse 13 adds, so the Egyptians ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. And we also remember all the way back in chapter 1 that awful edict of the Pharaoh Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born of the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. And by the way, my friend Pastor Amy Schifrin, who's actually been here to St. Peter and visited with us, all these thousands of years later, she still bears the name of one of the two faithful midwives or midwives that refused to obey Pharaoh's edict. Suffice to say, the time in Egypt was unpleasant, but also unbecoming of God's people who to have to serve these wicked pagans. And of course, remember as well the story of Moses, how his family kept him hidden for a time until they couldn't any longer. And then about 3 months old, they placed him in that basket and set it in the reeds, the cattails along the river. And Pharaoh's daughter found him and adopted him and paid his birth family to nurse him and care for him until he was old enough to begin being raised as a prince of Egypt. Now, later we remember that Moses catches an Egyptian abusing a Hebrew slave, and he beats him to death and he buries him. And then later he catches 2 Hebrew slaves fighting and commands them to stop, and they look at him and say, what are you going to do about it? You going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? And then Moses realizes that his secret is out, and so he has to flee Pharaoh's wrath. He ends up out in the desert in the wilderness, and he travels until he ends up at a well, and he catches some local shepherds abusing the girls and women drawing water. So he defends the women and runs off these bad shepherds. And then out of gratitude, one of the women, Zipporah, brings him home to her father Jethro, who welcomes Moses into his household. He marries Zipporah and then goes to work as a shepherd for his father-in-law. Now that brings us all, catches us up now to this episode of the burning bush. And surely Moses as a shepherd has seen plenty of burning bushes in his life. But notice what's different about this burning bush. The surprise is not the burning. The surprise is not that it's on fire, but it's not burning up. And once it has his attention, God speaks to Moses saying, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And several interesting things happen here in this section, right? First is the voice. He hears God. That reminds us, as St. Paul writes in Romans chapter 10, faith comes by hearing, not by seeing the miraculous, right? Remember, Pharaoh is always told first what will happen before he sees it. And the good news must be proclaimed. It must be spoken and told. Folks will not magically figure it out by observing the ordinary or even the extraordinary. But second, notice how Moses reacts to the bush. He turns aside from it for fear that he will encounter the fullness of God's presence unmediated. Right? God's always very careful in the Bible to prevent us from bearing the full weight of his all-consuming purity and glory directly. And then Moses, unlike the Egyptians, does not confuse the bush with God himself. Right? That is, he realizes the bush is not God. Now the pagans, the Egyptians, they would have thought that somehow the divinity had become mixed into the nature of the bush, making the bush some kind of God itself. Now, in this story, we hear that God comes from outside his creation, right? Outside of nature. But then third, listen to what God says. First, he says he is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Second, that he has heard his people's cry. And third, that he has come to do something about it. And fourth, he reveals his own name to Moses. And fifth, his name is forever connected to the promise made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. Now, certainly this Bible story gives us plenty to ponder and discuss, but our focus today is on that third point, what God says. When God reveals his name to Moses, it's very strange. His name is a verb, to be or is, and the Hebrew language doesn't use the helping verb am, right? Like I am. And so for us to make sense of it in English, it ends up translated as I am, when it's really more something like I am to be, right? A lot of your Bibles, including the translation we use here, have a footnote that reads something like an alternative translation, I will be what I will be. So the point here is that God names himself something like existence itself, which reminds us of St. Paul's quote in Acts chapter 17, "In him we live and move and have our being." And it reminds us in Genesis as well when God caused everything else to exist, which is all a very fine point by itself, but notice what it means in verse 7. The very ground of being and existence himself has heard his people's cries. He has a people. He's deeply attuned to their well-being. And his promise to them continues to exist long after Abraham and Isaac and Jacob have died. Now, depending on the timeline you look at, Abraham dies 330 years before Jacob, before this story, and Jacob dies about 200 years before Moses is born, who's now 80 years old himself. Are you beginning to understand the irony of old Ozymandias, of Ramses and his monuments, of Khufu and his great pyramid? Where are they? And where is their promise? And where is the one who made them king? Dead and gone. For us today, Jesus gives us the necessary interpretation of this passage in Exodus 3. Its significance is beyond the historical. It's more, not less, but more than the historical. In Luke chapter 20, Jesus tells his opponents, the Sadducees, "Now he is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him." Remember, God says, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Not, "I was," as if something could have changed about God and his nature and his promises. See, it's easy for us humans to think when something is past, it's done and gone for good. Again, consider Ramses' statue. Its promise of power died with him long ago. It would have been easy for the Israelites to look upon their generations of oppression, beginning with Ishmael over his brother Isaac, and think that God was no longer with them. To think that the promise of the promised land had died 200 years earlier with Jacob, or Joseph 140 years earlier. God says, no, he is God of the living. His promises live with him. How much clearer can he be when later even his own son lives a new life beyond the reach of his death on the cross? The exodus from death and slavery in Egypt prepares the way for the exodus from sin, death, and the devil in the cross and resurrection of Jesus. The promise of life in God's rest lives with him alone, and he calls you into it. So the God that made his living promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the same God that called to Moses in the bush to lead his people from death to life in the promised land. That's the same God who is the Father of Jesus and through whom we have life and salvation. He's the same God who hears our cries and prayers today, just as he did for those Hebrews thousands of years ago. He's the same God who receives into his arms all of our faithfully departed brothers and sisters as we all await together that last day of the resurrection and the judgment and life everlasting. Now, God doesn't give us a burning bush today out in the wilderness to mediate his presence. He calls to you and me from his word, and he's present for us here on this holy ground of his house of prayer. He incorporates us into the baptized body of his son Jesus, and he incorporates himself into our bodies, giving us his own body and blood in Holy Communion. And he does all of this so that we may know the power of his endless life in our lives now and in the life to come. Many sufferings in life remain unexplained. How long, O Lord, is always a cry and question of his people. But it never falls on deaf ears. Because God's promises of forgiveness, life, and salvation are always alive with him, and they are always coming to us. Just as they came to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to Moses, the prophets, and the people, and just as the final promise of the resurrection of our physical bodies and his judgment of the living and the dead will soon come. Amen.